Hi coders, welcome back to the Flask Mastery series. In this session, we are going to implement an endpoint that updates the user details. So open up your favorite IDE and let's get started. So within our user controller, we are going to go ahead and make reuse of the last endpoint that we worked with. And that was the endpoint that gets a user by their ID. So I'm going to copy this up. So having copied it, I'm going to delete all these other statements that we are not going to use as of now. So having deleted all this, I'm going to update the route, and this is going to be /edit. Then we pass in the user ID. Endpoints that require us updating a particular resource also work with the route parameters. So still the route parameter is going to be the ID and it is of type int. So we can update this to route. When we work with the route function, it takes in the path or the URL for the endpoint, and then the second parameter it takes in is the methods param. So this is methods, and it is always a list of the kind of methods that are going to be used for this endpoint. So we are going to pass in the put method and then the patch method. So the put method is always used in a way that we want to update the entire details on a particular resource. So for this case, we are going to use it in a way that we want to update all the user details. And the patch method works in a way that it only updates a particular attribute or a property on a resource. So for this case, the patch method will be used if we only wanted to update particular details of a user, like maybe the email address or the contact. And also I'm going to ensure that we are protecting the route. So at JWT required decorator is going to be kept. And then the function name is going to be update user details. And since we are going to be updating details of a particular user, we still have to pass in the ID as the parameter for this function. And also I'm ensuring that we are still working with error handling so that we can catch any errors that arise in the process of testing this endpoint. So within our try block, I'm going to create a variable that is going to store this user when we retrieve them from the database through the ID that comes from the request. So this is going to be user, and we are making the query against our user model. Then we filter by the user's ID, and the attribute that is in the database is ID. And then we want to filter it against the ID that is coming from this request. And we want to ensure that we are getting the first record. So there would be cases whereby we are receiving requests of an ID that does not exist on our database. So we have to ensure that we are returning a response that lets the user know that that ID does not exist by returning a simple response that pretty says that user not found. So if not the user, then we return a response that the user does not exist or the user is not found. And for this kind of response, where we do not find a particular resource item within our database, we have to ensure that we are also passing in the status code. And the status code for this case is going to be a 404, a not found status code. So I will ensure that I am importing it. So first of all, we are going to ensure that only administrators have the ability of updating the user details, and that the ID coming from the request must belong to the currently logged in user. So with the fact that we have protected our route with the JWT required decorator, I'm going to work with the get JWT identity function such that we get the currently logged in user identity. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable current user, and I'm going to assign it to the get JWT identity function. So the get JWT identity returns the ID of a currently logged in user, especially for cases whereby we have protected the route. So that means that I have to go ahead and define a variable that is going to store the ID itself. So this is going to be logged in user, and I'm going to ensure that I'm making a query on the model So we have to filter against the ID, and the ID we have to pass in is going to be the ID for the currently logged in user. So this is going to be current user, and we ensure that we are getting the first record. So .first. So having defined these variables, we have to work with an if condition that is going to check for the type of the user that is currently logged in, and also to check if the ID that is coming from the request matches the ID of the currently logged in user. So I'm going to create an if else condition. So if else the logged in user, then dot the user type is not equal to admin, and the user for whom we want to update their details, then dot their ID is also not equal to the currently logged in user. Then we are going to return a response, and the value for the response is going to be that you are not authorized or permitted to update the user details. So if the currently logged in user type is of an admin, or if the ID that is coming in from the request matches the ID of the currently logged in user, then we have to go ahead and update the user details. So if we are to update the user details, we need to store the request body that is coming from the request. So meaning that we have to store the information that is submitted while this request is being made. So for example, if we wanted to update maybe the username or the first name and the last name or the email address, we have to ensure that this data is stored. Then we proceed with committing them to the database. So within our user model, we have attributes like the first name, the last name, the email, the contact, image, and then the password, plus the biography, and then the user type. So I'm going to copy these and then paste them here, then make sure that I'm updating the indentation. So for us to cater for the first name, we are going to work with a request object, and then .get JSON such that we get the key for the first name. So for cases whereby we are updating the user details and maybe we are not updating the first name, we have to ensure that while other details are updated, the first name is not updated. So to keep the first name, we shall make use of our user variable, and then we pass in the first name property. And this is going to be the same case for all these other attributes. And then for the password, we are going to handle the password differently in a way that we are going to ensure that it is hashed. So for us to be able to hash the password, we are going to check if the password exists in the request. So if password in request.json, then I'm going to go ahead and create a variable that is going to store our hashed password. So since we are working with bcrypt, we have to ensure that we are importing the bcrypt object so that we can access it to hash the password. So from app.extensions, we import db, and then we shall also import the bcrypt object. And then we access bcrypt.generate password hash. And then the value is going to be our password that is coming from the request. So request.json.get, then we pass in the key for the password. So this will ensure that if the password is submitted within the request, it must be created in a way that it is hashed. And having created this, we have to ensure that we are updating the user password. So we are going to access the user object, then the password attribute, and then we assign the value to our hashed password. So having worked on this, we are now going to go ahead and ensure that the variables that are coming from the request are stored for each user property. So we are going to first of all cater for the first name. So this is going to be user.the first name, and then the first name will be updated to the first name variable that we have defined. and this is going to be true for the last name, and then the variable is going to be the last name that we have defined. Same applies to all these other details. So I'm going to go ahead and update this very fast. So now we have to ensure that we commit all these changes to the database. So I'm going to access the DB object and then .session, then we commit. So having committed, we have to ensure that we are returning a response, and the response is going to be customized in a way that we can say that Gorret in our Tanz's details have been updated successfully. So I'm going to define a variable username that is going to have the last name and the first name of the user being concatenated together. So we are going to access the user object, then we access the full name function, and having defined this, we are going to return the response. So in the response, we are going to have the message. We are also going to have the user object being returned. So I'm going to go ahead and update this very fast. So our response has the username. For example, Nabatanzi Gorret's details have been successfully updated, and then all this other information. So right now I'm going to go ahead and test our endpoint to ensure that it is working as expected. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new request, and then the request name is going to be update user details or update user, and then the URL is going to be users/edit/ the ID of the user that we want to work with. So we are going to test this with ID2, and then we are going to work with a patch method such that we first test case where we are updating a few details on the user. And whenever we are making put and patch requests, we also need a request body, and this is going to be a dictionary. So within our database, user ID2 is Gorret Namakula. So we are going to try to update the first name to Daphne. So the key for this is going to be first name, then the value is Daphne, and not forgetting that our route was protected. So I'll ensure that I'm passing in the access token. So when I make a new request, the first name is now returned as Daphne, and then the other details are not changed. So I'm going to go ahead and try to update her email address. So email, and then the email address, I'm going to copy this such that we update it to daphne@gmail.com. So when I make a new request, we can see that the email address has been updated, and when I try to refresh the database, we can see that the email address has been updated. So I'm also going to go ahead and update her contact. So I'll add in a new key for the contact. So when I make a new request, okay, for the contact, I forgot to update the key, so the key has to be contact. So I'm going to make a new request. So when I make a new request, the information is updated. So I'm also going to try to test for cases whereby maybe Daphne wanted to update her email address to angel@gmail.com. So instead of the contact, we are going to retest this email address with an already existing email address. So when I try to make a request, this is the response that is returned. So we actually attached constraints on our database in terms of the email address and then the contact number, where they must be unique. So for this case, we have to ensure that before we update the user details, we are also checking if the email address or a contact that is coming from the request exists. And if any of those exists, then we have to tell the user that either the email address exists or the contact exists. So we are going to check if the email address from the request is not equal to the email address that is stored in the database for this user. So this is going to be user.email, And we shall also make a query to the database to check if there is an email address in the database that matches the incoming email address from the request. So if user.query.filter by the email, and the value is going to be assigned to the incoming email address from the request, and then we shall ensure that we are only making the query against the first record. So .first. So if the email address already exists, we have to return a JSONified response. So we return JSONify. So the key for this case is going to be an error, and then the value is going to be email address already in use. And then the status code for this case, it's going to be a conflict, and this is going to be HTTP 409 conflict. So I'm going to copy this code and make sure that we are reusing it for the contact. So I'm going to go ahead and run the application. So now when I make a new request, we can see that the response is now customized. We are getting contact. It should be contact already in use. So now we are going to try to update all these details at once. So the biography is going to be, I have an experience of 3 years. And then the contact is going to be this. And then the email address is going to be Daphne23. Then the first name is going to be Daffy. And then the last name is going to be Nabatanzi. And then the type is going to remain the same. So if I try to update the method to put and make a new request, we can still see that the details are updated. This is the response that we get. We are also going to go ahead and update her password and see whether she has the ability to log in, having updated the password. So right now we can see that her password is 1 up to 8. So she has the ability of logging in. So we are going to go ahead and update this password to Daphne. So having updated the password, we are going to log her in again. So we can see that when we also update her password, she still has the ability of logging in. So lastly, we are going to try to test a case whereby Daphne wants to update Baroda Angel's details. So Baroda Angel is ID 3. So I'm going to pass in ID 3, and we are going to ensure that the access token we are using for this request is going to be the access token that belongs to Daphne. So I'm going to copy it and paste it within our authorization headers. And instead of the password for Angel Baroda, maybe we can update her email address. So this is going to be email. And then the email address that we are going to use is going to be angel12@gmail.com. So when I make a new request, the response that we get is this: you are not authorized to update her details. So the only problem here that we are having is the status code. It must not be 200. So the user is going to be forbidden. So we have to work with the 403 status code. So I will ensure that we are having the 403 status code within our status codes. And when I try to make a new request, we can see that the status code has been updated. So in the previous vid, I think I forgot to test for a case whereby the user ID that has been passed in the request does not exist within our database on our server. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this statement and paste it within our endpoint. So if not user, return user not found. So I'm going to go ahead and test this, make a new request. You can see that we are getting the user details. But how about if I passed in 300 as the ID for the request? So we can see that the response that is returned is a 404 status code, and we are having the message as user not found. So that's all for this session. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like and subscribe if you found the video helpful to you.